It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Gail Fawcett is a Senior Research Advisor at Employment and Social Development Canada. Gail designs and conducts research on persons with disabilities at ESDC, primarily using data from Statistics Canada to support program and policy development in the department and in connection with Canada's reporting requirements for the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. She has been involved with this type of research for nearly 30 years. Gail also participates in questionnaire design and data development. Gail joins us today to talk about the dynamics of disability. We will have a short period of time to take any questions at the end of her presentation. You are welcome to type your questions into the Q&A box. Just click on the button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Alternatively, you can raise your hand virtually, use the Zoom function, and we will do our best to get back to you. Welcome, Gail.
Okay, thanks for having me. And the slide was up. It should be coming. Okay, there it is. Oops, sorry. Okay, yeah, I have it now. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking to you today about some data the most recent data that we have on episodic disability for persons with disabilities. And it comes from the Canadian Survey on Disability from 2017. And at that time, we were able to get two questions on. The concept of disability is really, really complex. And I know that there's sort of it's often spoken about as a sort of an on again, off again pattern. But of course, I think probably everybody who's watching here is aware that it's a lot more complex than that. Essentially, what we're doing is looking at dynamic patterns of disability that people experience, things that are basically something other than the traditional stereotype that disability is constant, static, and sort of never changing. And that's the sort of the stereotype upon which all of our programs and are sort of developed. So if that's not what many people with disabilities look like, then we really do need to know that. So we did get two questions on the last Canadian Survey on Disability to try to find out a little bit more about episodic disability, but instead we sort of got more of a whole range of dynamics. And it was over 30 years ago now that I first saw data from the late 80s, early 90s, where it was clear that people had some sort of a change in disability from year to year. And since that time, we've heard all kinds of sort of terms used anywhere from, I'm just going to read them, probably maybe just advance my slides a little bit. I'm not sure who's doing the slides. Anyway, yeah, okay, so yeah, no, is the last one. That's okay, it doesn't matter. So you've probably heard terms like progressive, degenerative, periodic, sporadic, intermittent, recurrent, fluctuating, and even invisible. Many countries around the world have done similar research, used any combination of those kinds of terms. But the term I think everybody here is most familiar with, and the term that's really gotten traction is episodic disability. And I think what I'm sort of advocating doing is using that term because people respond to it, but to mean something more about the dynamics around disability. So I'm going to have you switch to the first, I'm not sure which slide this is, like slide 12 maybe? Maybe switch to slide 12. I think the easiest way to get through this quickly is to just tell you, a bit further. Oh, is that slide 12? The slide that starts with the 4 basic patterns of disability. Yep, that's it, thanks. So yeah, that's it. So I'm going to start with this slide and explain, this one. So, and I'll explain the different groups, the different dynamic groups that we were able to identify. So the continuous, that's the stereotype. Those are people who things are fairly constant, not much change day after day. Expectations are things will be pretty much the same in the future. We were also able to identify a group of people, we called it progressive disability. Some of them did experience fluctuations of varying lengths, but the predominant thing was the disability. Oh, if you could just go back to the last slide. I don't know what's going on here. The thing is, the sort of predominant characteristic is over time, the degree of limitation is becoming greater and greater, and needs for supports are also becoming greater and greater. So that's what progressive is. Then we have recurrent, and those were people who did have a sort of a true on again, off again type of pattern. Many of them would have, these are people who would get maybe a month or even more where they didn't feel limited, but then the limitation always comes back. So we call those recurrent. So the key aspect of that is, yes, it is an on and off pattern of limitation, but you can have a fairly lengthy period of time in between being limited. Then the fourth category is fluctuating. And for this group, they never go as long as a month without feeling limited, but they do have periods, shorter periods, where they are limited and there is an on again, off again pattern. It's a little more unpredictable, and there are shorter periods without the limitation, but again, it's always coming back. So then if we could just go to the first page of results, you'll have to go down to the results at least 3 and 5 PWD do not conform to the stereotype. Yeah, no, the next slide. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, keep it there. Sorry. So, okay, so what were the results? So the results were, we've got 6.2 million adults with disabilities in Canada, and that parcels out into about 2.4 million who seem to conform to the stereotype of something that was fairly continuous, not much fluctuation, and 3.8 million, or 61%, who experience some type of dynamic disability, some type of change, whether it's progressive, recurrent, or fluctuating. We'll get to that in the next slide, but for now, we're going to stay here because I do want to talk with you a little bit about the next Canadian survey on disability. And we have some additional questions that we've added to the episodic disability module. And I shout out to Tammy Hates, who was very, very helpful in some consultations that we did. Thanks again, Tammy. So we did, we will have more data. I suspect, don't know for sure, but I suspect within that 2.4 million that there are people who do experience change. They may never be without a limitation, but the degree to which they're limited will vary. And we did see this a lot in qualitative testing that we did for the last survey around episodic disabilities. And we did see a lot of people who, there was always that level of being limited, but sometimes it would just be quite a bit more limited than others. So there was variation, but they were never without a limitation. And I suspect hiding in that group are some people like that. We'll be able to tease that out because now we're going to be able to figure out how many people have sort of a more severe limitation at times and less at others. So now let's go to this 3.8 million and let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now here we're just looking at those people who came in as having experiencing some type of dynamic. So the 3.8 million, the largest group that it sort of goes into right below is that 1.5 million who have what we called recurrent limitations. So that's 41% have something that recurs. It comes and it goes, but the key thing here is they get a fairly lengthy period of time when they're not limited, up a month or more in some cases. So in the future, you'll see these little, the red font below it. In the future, when we get the new data, what we're hoping to be able to do is further parcel out this group into those who have, maybe a long limitation, a long period where they're limited, that long period without limitations. We may also be able to get those who have short limitations and a fairly lengthy period in between without. And then you may get another group where things are very unpredictable, because in qualitative testing, it was this unpredictability. That was the facet of all of this that really, really seemed to create the greatest barriers for people. And we do have questions around predictability. So, and then if we go to the 1.4 million who had progressive limitations, that's just a little over a third. Remember, these are people who they might experience some degree of fluctuation, but over time they're getting more and more limited, requiring more and more supports. So what we need to know then, we'll be parceling that out in the future into those who have some type of pure progressive, where every day is just kind of, things are getting increasingly limited. And you may also have people who, that's more of a long-term thing. Every day there's this sort of dynamic that's going up and down and lots of fluctuation, although it's sort of, over time, going to increasing limitations rather. So that's another place where we're going to be getting some more data. And then over to the right-hand side, you'll see this 0.8 million or 22% who have fluctuating limitations. Now, these people never get a month without being limited, so their periods without limitation are very short. What we need to know and what we should be finding out in the future is those who have maybe a long limitation period with a short period without, or whether they have a very short period of limitation, short period without, whether they're sort of kind of really sort of quick little fluctuations, or whether it's more like a kind of like that. Then again, those with unpredictable, because as I said before, that lack of predictability seems to be the most critical factor. Not everyone has lack of unpredictability, but many do. And that's what we're going to be able to get with the next CSD. The other thing I wanted to say is these are patterns of how people experience their disability. These are not people. So people can move throughout these. You may find somebody who begins with a progressive limitation, or who begins, let's say, with a fluctuating or even a recurrent limitation. Things change over time. Maybe they would go into the fluctuating limitation box, and then maybe even to progressive limitations. And so these are patterns of experience rather than patterns of people. And if you could turn to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of a view over, yeah. So what we find, for example, is with age, as age increases, recurrent and fluctuating limitations start to decrease the prevalence of them. You're more likely to see an increase in the number of people with progressive limitations. And so you can almost see people kind of moving through that last diagram into that sort of more progressive. In terms of gender, and I think Deputy Minister LaRoche spoke to this as well, women are more likely to have fluctuating limitations, and men are more likely to have continuous limitations. So that all of this kind of is very reflective of what was found in the public service survey. So, and keep in mind that many of our programs are sort of developed around the concept of a continuous limitations. So if that's something that's perhaps more, characteristic for men, and women are more characteristic of the fluctuating limitations, you can see the potential gender bias. Again, with severity, the more severe the disability, the more likely it is to be a progressive limitation. And the number of types of disabilities one has is also associated with the dynamics. So for those with recurrent limitations, and remember, those are the people who have a fairly large period in between, only, sorry, yeah, sorry, all I can see is the chat, sorry. So we have three and five of those with progressive limitations who have 4 or more types of disabilities. So that's, again, the greater number of disability types is going to be more associated with progressive disabilities, and recurrent is much less likely to have, a lot of disability types. So now let's go to the next slide. So how does all this impact employment? Well, these are the employment rates by the different types. You'll see, and this is a population 25 to 64, so sort of working force, working age. 80% of those without disabilities were employed. The 59%, that's all people with disabilities. But then if we parcel them out into the next 4 groups, we see that recurrent and continuous have the highest employment rates. And then we start to see fluctuating. And remember, those are the sort of the short periods without, but a lot of movement, as along with progressive, down to 40% employment rate for progressive. So those progressive disabilities would have an employment rate that's half of what people without disabilities have. And I'm trying to, let's go to the next. I'm trying to get through fairly quickly. So if we could go to the next slide. The next slide. Sorry, okay. Well, I'll just describe what's in it. So if we take a look at the experiences in the labor market that people have, again, they vary according to the dynamic state. So is there any way we could go to the next slide? Thanks, great. Okay, so you can see here, people who take a leave of absence from work of a month or more, those people are more likely to have either progressive or fluctuating. Those who say that it limits the amount or the kind of work that they can do, again, those with both fluctuating and progressive limitations are much more likely to indicate that, 50% for those with fluctuating and 62% for those with progressive. Those who indicate that they would have difficulty changing their job or advancing at their current job, again, that's going to be a greater impact for those with fluctuating and progressive disabilities. So 65% of those progressive disabilities, for example, say that they'd have a very difficult time if they had to change jobs, and a very difficult time if they had to advance in their current job. And then perceived employment discrimination, again, a similar pattern. Those with both fluctuating and progressive are more likely to report that they've faced discrimination, up to about a quarter of those with progressive disabilities. And if we could go to the next one, the next slide. Thanks. So this is the requirements for workplace accommodations. So again, what we see is a flexible work arrangements. Those with progressive disabilities are more likely to have that requirement, followed by those with fluctuating disabilities. For workstation modification, progressive disabilities, again, and fluctuating disabilities have higher needs. We could just get back to that slide. Yeah, great. And then those who require human or technical supports, again, it's most likely to be those with progressive or fluctuating disabilities. So you can see the pattern really, those are the two groups where it seems to have a much greater impact. And I'm not surprised, given everything that we saw in qualitative testing. And so the next slide, please. So this is the number of workplace accommodations that are required. If we take a look at those who only require a single workplace accommodation, it's more likely to be those with recurrent and continuous disabilities. So those are the people who, that's the stereotype, along with those who have the long period without disability in between. So those are the two that are most likely to require just a single. If they require an accommodation, it's usually just one. For those who have progressive and fluctuating disabilities, as we've seen, this is kind of, you can see the pattern that's been, coming out from slide to slide. They tend to have quite a few more workplace accommodation requirements. So over a third of those two groups, 36 and 37%, have a requirement for 3 or more types of workplace accommodations. So you can see the complexity that they will face in the labor market when having to, arrange for all of these things. So I see David, and that means I'm getting close. So we'll skip, how about we skip the next slide? And I think I'm just going to go straight to the takeaway. So I think what you realize is certainly the dynamic patterns that people face have a lot of implications for their labor market requirements and their success in the labor market. And I think the other thing that I really want to be able to tell you is that we're going to get a lot better data. We're going to be able to look at people who have long periods in between, long periods with limitation, people with shorter periods of limitation, that all of those different combinations of permutations. And I have a feeling that we'll be able to define perhaps several different types of episodic disabilities by the patterns that they experience. So I'll leave it there for now. And okay, so do I go into the question and answer? Oh.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. There's been a lot of activity in the Q&A, so we really appreciate that. And thanks, Gail. That was great. Very comprehensive and very interesting. It's always good to hear a little bit more about a report and kind of dig into it. We have a couple of questions from Rebecca. She has asked, has there been any considerations at ESDC regarding increasing the frequency of the Canadian Survey on Disabilities?
Okay, no. And the reason is, it can only be done every 5 years. In order to get a sample size as large as you need to be able to unpack things and look at this level of detail, you need a huge sample size. And the only way we can do that is to develop a sampling frame from the census. So that means every 5 years, because the census is only done every 5 years. So the Canadian Survey on Disability requires a module that's on the long form census, which detects people who have a high likelihood of having a disability. And then based on that, they build the sampling frame for the Canadian Survey on Disability. So for example, the census is taking place later this spring, and the CSD will be in the field next winter. So it takes that time to be able to get the results from the census, build the sampling frame, sample from within the sampling frame, and then contact people. So unfortunately, because of the nature of the size that's required, it can only be done every 5 years.
Okay. We've got time for another couple of questions. The first one is, how do mental health disabilities translate into the 4 descriptors that are used within the dynamics report?
They're found in all of them. Like all of those 4 groups that we detailed, you will see people with mental health in all of them. And it's really a grab bag, to be honest with you. I wouldn't say they're predominantly more in one than the other. And this is where I think teasing out the greater detail next time around with those more detailed questions, we'll be able to kind of unpack that a little bit more. But you'd be surprised at the issue with that is that a lot of the people with mental health related disabilities also have a physical disability. So you're not entirely sure which one they're talking about when they talk about limitation. And generally people are answering with respect to everything all at once. Okay. But you do find mental health throughout the whole spectrum. You find a lot of them in recurrent. You do find a lot in the fluctuating, and you do find a lot as well in continuous, along with progressive. But again, they usually have multiple disability types.
Okay, I see. One last question. Have there been any updates to the CSD, the Canadian Survey on Disabilities, to better understand the impact of COVID on individuals with disability?
Yes, actually, we're going to sort of talk about that on Friday a little bit. Yes and no, because the content review was started before COVID. And at some point, you know, when we realized that it was like never leaving, we did have an effort to find out, first of all, if the people, I believe what they're going to do, but it still has to be tested in another iteration that'll happen probably in the fall. And so they'll be looking at, were you diagnosed with COVID? We do know age of onset. So people are asked when something began. So we will be able to see people who were diagnosed with COVID, who maybe had a recent onset, and we will be able to sort of make some inferences as to the greater impact, how COVID might be impacting just the rate of disability and what it might look like. As Tammy mentioned, the sort of the long haulers is something that we're quite concerned with, and being able to identify them and what that looks like. So we should be able to isolate a population who either recently developed a disability, like in 2020, or even 2021, who indicated that they've tested positive for COVID. We will also be able to see people who maybe had disabilities quite a bit earlier, but maybe a new one that was onset in 2020 or 2021, and they were diagnosed with COVID. So we will be able to do quite a bit of sort of teasing around and taking a look at, all right, so in terms of the dynamics, what is this looking like? Because I mean, my gut instinct, I have no data at this point, but my gut instinct is we should be prepared to see an increase in the disability rate from people who perhaps are still, still experiencing limitations as a result of COVID, but also in terms of mental health from isolation. So those are the things that we're going to be looking for, and we should be able to tease some of that out.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Gail. And thanks everyone for your questions. We are a little bit behind at this point and we've only just begun. So I'm going to hand things back over to David. Thanks, Gail, for a really great session. And Gail will be speaking again on Friday morning or Friday afternoon if anybody else would like to hear more.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And thank you, Gail. We really appreciate the work that you're doing at ESDC. Quantitative analysis on people living with disabilities in Canada, and particularly episodic disabilities, has been difficult to come by over the years, which has made it more difficult to get an accurate picture of the scope of the challenges we face in the episodic disability community. So your work is so invaluable to us.